Good morning. This is the fifth Sunday of Lent. Our title today is Hi Ho the Derry-O. Yes, I have totally lost it. But first, I don't know if you heard the news or not. Tragic news, really. An old man fell into a well. Apparently, he couldn't see that well. Okay, Hi-Ho the Derry-O. This sounds light, and I hope I can interject a little humor. But this is one of those R-rated stories that is scattered through the Bible, and we're just going to do the best we can. It's the kind where I'm going to say some ugly words, but bear with me. Have you ever had one bad choice lead to another? I have. They have a way of piling up sometimes, but the good news is that no matter how many bad choices we've made, if we can find a way, with God's help, to make that first good choices, things can start looking up for us. This week's Bible passage and our teaching detail a chain reaction of bad choices in the Old Testament book of Judges. I guarantee you never heard this story in Sunday school when you were a kid. Let's read from Judges chapter 21, verses 15 through 25. I'm going to invite you to stand and let's read it together. The people grieved for the tribe of Benjamin because the Lord had made a gap in the tribes of Israel. And the elders of the assembly said, "With the women of Benjamin destroyed, how shall we provide wives for the men who are left? The Benjamite survivors must have heirs," they said, "so that a tribe of Israel will not be wiped out. We can't give them our daughters as wives, since we Israelites have taken this oath. Cursed be anyone who gives a wife to a Benjamite. But look, there is the annual festival of the Lord in Shiloh, which lies north of Bethel, east of the road that goes from Bethel to Shechem, and south of Lebonah." So they instructed the Benjamites, saying, "Go and hide in the vineyards and watch. When the young women of Shiloh come out to join in the dancing, rush from the vineyards, and each one of you seize one of them to be your wife. Then return to the land of Benjamin. When their fathers or brothers complain to us, we will say to them, 'Do us the favor of helping them, because we did not get wives for them during the war. You will not be guilty of breaking your oath, because you did not give your daughters to them.' So that is what the Benjamites did. While the young men were dancing, each man caught one and carried her off to be his wife. Then they returned to their inheritance and rebuilt the towns and settled in them. At that time, the Israelites left that place and went home to their tribes and clans, each to his own inheritance. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit." And this is the word of God for the people of God. Thank you. Please be seated. This is also the first recorded usage of the phrase, "Hi ho the Derry-O, the farmer takes a wife." That was 11 verses you read. That was a long portion, but that's just the tail end of this story. There is so much more. And to get to the whole story, we have to back up a couple chapters to chapter 19. And while it's just my nature to bring a little levity, this is actually a gruesome story of rape and murder and vengeance. And I'm telling you, this could be the next installment of HBO's True Detective. The 19th chapter of Judges begins, "In those days Israel had no king." And the closing verse of chapter 21, which we just read, says, "In those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit." If we were singing the book of Judges as a hymn, this would pretty much be the chorus to every stanza. In those days Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. Our story begins with a Levite living in Ephraim. Now, I have a map of some of the tribes of Judah and tribes of Israel. Judah was a large tribal inheritance stretching from the north end of the Dead Sea southward almost to Egypt. That was Judah. Just above them was Benjamin, a very small holding, and just above Benjamin was Ephraim. Jerusalem, which was called Jebus at the time, was practically on the border of Jerusalem and Benjamin, just barely into Benjamin's territory, but Benjamin was never able to conquer Jerusalem until King David came along and took Jerusalem for himself, and so it became known as the city of David. So our story begins with a Levite from the tribal holding of Ephraim who takes a concubine from Judah. And the primary reason a Levite or any man in that time period would take a concubine would be that it was likely he and his wife were having trouble getting pregnant. And it was always assumed that it was the woman's problem. And so the husband would take a concubine to have a male heir through that woman. And according to the story, this Levite's concubine is unfaithful. Now be careful, don't jump to conclusions about a definition of that. But she runs home to her parents in Judah, and we'll talk about why that might have been as we go. 4 months later, the Levite goes after her. 4 months later, the Levite goes after her, and the girl's father seems very happy to see him, but he can't bring himself to send his daughter away. And so, long story short, they get a late start heading back to Judah. They hit that Bethlehem traffic. You know how that is. And they're caught on the road as evening comes. The servant says, "Hey, look, we're right here at Jebus, Jerusalem. Let's spend the night there." But the Levite insists on making it into Benjamin, and that turned out to be a fatal mistake. So they stop in the town of Gibeah. They wait in the city square where the rules of hospitality dictate that someone from the town should invite them to come home with them, but no one does. Finally, an old man who also happens to be from Ephraim, he comes in from working in the fields to his home in Gibeah and insists that they come stay with him. What are you doing in the town square? Well, no one has invited us in, but we have plenty of food and water. We'll be fine. No, come and stay with me. And they do just that. Does this story sound familiar from anything we've talked about in the last few weeks? Well, after they get cleaned up and they're having dinner, men from the city pound on the door and say, "Bring us out the man who came to your house so we can have sex with him." Does this story sound familiar to anyone? But the owner of the house offers these wicked men his virgin daughter and the concubine of the Levite. Does this story sound familiar to anyone? So the evil men of the village, they aren't interested in this compromise. So the Levite, to save himself, let's be honest, he shoves his concubine out the door, slams the door, and the men of the city, there's no pretty way to say this, they rape this concubine a good portion of the night and leave her for dead. In the morning, the Levite finds his concubine lying dead on the doorstep. If you read between the lines, after she was raped repeatedly, she was able to crawl back to the doorstep where she died, and where maybe the Levite would have found her if he'd been watching for her and hadn't just gone to bed for the night. So the Levite loads her body on his donkey and heads for home. When he gets back to Ephraim, and let me warn you, this gets ugly. Yeah, it gets ugly. It's already been ugly. When he gets back to Ephraim, he cuts her body up into 12 pieces, sends one to each of the tribes of Israel as a call for war and vengeance on Benjamin. Basically, this is a challenge. This is what Benjamin did. Now, what are you going to do about it? And then, when Israel assemblies, the Levite addresses them and tells them what happened. He embellishes the danger to himself, not to diminish the violence of rape, but he doesn't say they wanted to have sex with him. He said they wanted to kill him. And he conveniently leaves out the part where he shoved his concubine out the door to save himself. But after this Levite agitates the crowd, they transition to a herd instinct to take out their anger on Gibeah. And chapter 20 details the first civil war in the history of Israel. 11 tribes against one. I couldn't figure out when I was reading this why, if it was one town, the town of Gibeah, why all of Israel came out against all of Benjamin. But the narrative tells us that Israel gave Benjamin a choice. Hand over the offenders from Gibeah that we might put them to death, which was the Old Testament punishment. But Benjamin refused. So an Israeli army of 400,000 fighting men goes to war against 26,000 men from Benjamin, in addition to the 700 other fighting men from the town of Gibeah itself. And this is not without losses for Israel. The first two attempts to take the city are disastrous. In the first attack, they lose 22,000 men. The next day they try it again and lose another 18,000 men. And so at that point they take a break and ask God, did we hear you right? Are we supposed to attack Gibeah? And God assures them, and these are my words, but God assures them that third time is the charm and that everything will be okay. And sure enough, that day, they pretty much wipe out Gibeah. 25,000, and all of Benjamin. They kill 25,000 Benjamites, not to mention all the women and children that were left in Gibeah. And then, as if their bloodlust cannot be quenched, the armies of Israel march throughout Benjamin and put to the sword, which is a lovely euphemism for slaughtered, all those left in the cities and villages of Benjamin, the old men, the women, the children, leaving only 600 Benjamite men with no wives, no prospects for having children, while they had taken a vow not to give their daughters to Benjamin as wives. And this goes way beyond retribution. This goes to genocide. And in spite of the inconceivable tragedy detailed here, again, it's so tragic, I have to put some humor in there, or it's just going to make me cry. Rather than a Bible story, this is more like a Three Stooges feature-length film. And I want to look at, I want to call it the comedy of errors, even though there's nothing funny about it. But the bad decisions just pile up in this story. And this is really a series of tragic choices compounded by still more bad decisions. No one would believe this if it were a news story. Let's just run through some of the bad choices that were running rampant in this dramedy. Let's start with the Levite. And this kind of proves that preachers are not always the smartest people in the room. I know it was legal to take a second wife or a concubine in Old Testament times, but is that ever a good idea? It reminds me of a line from Everybody Loves Raymond, where Deborah is asking Raymond, "Are you having an affair?" And he says, "Yeah, just what I want to do, disappoint two women." Well, reading between the lines, the Levite treats his concubine like property, which, let's face it, in that time, that's what she was. When it says she was unfaithful, I don't think that means adultery, because if it had been adultery, they would have taken her and stoned her to death. Even though he waits 4 months, he finally goes after her. She probably went home to her parents because of how unappreciated she felt by this Levite. Then he waits 4 months to go find her and allows his father-in-law to talk him into staying longer than he should have. And the result is that he gets on the road later than he should. And the problem with that is the road is a dangerous place to be at night. It's sort of true today. It was way more true back then. So when evening falls, his servant suggests they bed down for the night in Jerusalem. But the Levite insists that they make it to Benjamin, and that is a tragic mistake. We've read the story of what happened in Gibeah, but I want to make sure you don't miss this. In Sodom, and that's the story I hope this reminds you of. In Sodom, when Lot offered his daughters to the townspeople to save his skin, the angels stopped him. But in Gibeah, there weren't any angels there to intervene for these girls, for this girl. The Levite gave his concubine to the townsfolk to save himself. Is it any wonder she left him? Can you blame her? Then the gruesome way he gets the word out to Israel. This is a calculating manner to agitate the people of Israel and to pour gasoline on the fire of just a horrendous deed by the men of Gibeah. And then when Israel gathers to hear his story, he embellishes the danger to himself. He leaves out the part about how he sacrificed his concubine to save himself. But Israel doesn't respond much better. They fall hook, line, and sinker for the Levites' propaganda, and their herd mentality takes over, and this all but assures catastrophe. They start out by making rash vows that none of them will ever give one of their daughters as wives for the tribe of Benjamin. And from the chronography of this story, this was before they went to war. And after their mob mentality led to destroying all of Benjamin, then they blame God for Benjamin being lost. Isn't that just like us? It's a rare person who will take the responsibility for their own bad choices. Then, in a now we have to fix this kind of panic, they're wondering, how do we come up with 600 wives for these men of Benjamin so Benjamin isn't wiped out completely? Well, they take stock. Now, who didn't show up for the battle against Gibeah? And they think, oh, none of the men from Jabesh-Gilead showed up. Jabesh-Gilead was from that area called Transjordan that we talked about a few weeks ago. That area east of the Jordan River, outside of the Promised Land. So they go and compound the trouble by slaughtering another town. And they take their 400 daughters as wives, killing everybody else, which leaves them 200 women short. So Mo and Larry come up with this plan that couldn't fail. Isn't it about time for Shiloh's annual festival when all their young women go out into the fields to dance? And they tell the 200 remaining Benjamites, go hide in the vineyards. And when the young women come out to dance, grab one you like and take her home to be your wife. You know, that's always a good foundation to build your home on. And they said, listen, you take one you like, take her home, and when their brothers and their fathers complain to us because you took their girls, we'll say, hey, do us this little favor, because we didn't get any wives for Benjamin during the war. And they say, I know you vowed not to give your daughters to Benjamin, but this way you aren't guilty of breaking your vow because you didn't give your daughters. Wink, wink. I'm telling you, you can't make this stuff up. Rosemary, it's time for you to head back for baptism. What's the lesson here? I told you, this is a long story, a long narrative, and a real short application. And this is it. Everyone makes bad choices every once in a while. But don't let one bad decision multiply like tribbles on the Enterprise. Sometimes we feel like the only choice we have is between two bad options. And we think, well, all we can do is go for the lesser of two evils. But I'm here to tell you that God never lets us get stuck on a one-way, dead-end street. There is always a right choice to make right now. Is it easy? I'd be lying if I said it was always easy to figure out the right thing to do. But count to 10. Bathe this decision in prayer. Get wise counsel, and you won't find yourself playing the farmer in the dell. Let's pray. Father, how often have our rash decisions turned out to be bad ones that piled up with one bad choice after another until it seems like there's no way out? God, help us avoid jumping in with both feet until we figure out how deep the water is. Help us count the cost before we start building and don't have enough funds to finish. Help us take time to breathe. Help us lean on you for wisdom, and help us get good counsel from people who love us enough to tell us the truth before we initiate the launch sequence. This is our prayer, O God. Amen.